rebel force has penetrated the shield and landed on Endor.
This is where the fun begins.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away.
This is Rebel Force Radio.
Your source for the Force.
Star Wars news and commentary.
With Jason Swank and Jimmy Mack.
I've seen Star Wars 500 times.
Star Wars #1!
This station is now the ultimate power in the universe. I suggest we use it.
Now it's time for Rebel Force Radio.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Rebel Force Radio, your source for the Force. Star Wars conversation, news, and interviews. And we got a great one for you this week. Joining us in the cantina, we get him back. We haven't talked to him for a while, but Dr. David West Reynolds, a trailblazer in so many ways, but of course got his claim to fame by being one of the very first to track down some of these incredible, iconic shooting locations for the original Star Wars trilogy. So much so that he got hired by Lucasfilm in the production of the prequel films to say, hey, we need somebody like this to show us where these locations are. And David West Reynolds fit the bill. He's a legit archaeologist, and but sort of known as the Star Wars archaeologist. And, of course, the author of incredible books like the Complete Visual Dictionary. These were amazing books back in the days when DK was putting out these incredible reference guides, cross-sections, all that. And David West Reynolds was a big central figure in all of that. So he'll be joining us in the cantina talking about what he's doing as of late, plus some news. We'll be catching up with the latest on the Rey film. I don't know if you'd call it good news. We'll be talking about that. Plus, Jude Law, Skeleton Crew coming up in early December. Jude Law starting to make some of the rounds as that the promotion around Skeleton Crew heats up. So all that and so much more this week on Rebel Force Radio. If you're new to the program, welcome. Introductions may be in order. If that's the case, my name is Jason, and with me, as always, my good friend and yours from Chicago, Jimmy Mack.
Hey, Jason. Hey, Star Wars fans. Really looking forward to reconnecting with David West Reynolds. He's a name that was commonplace to Star Wars fans in the bookstores of the prequel era. We would see his name on all those great books like the DK books you were showing, Jason, those incredible visual dictionaries or visual guides. They just really enhanced the whole experience of the prequels in those days when the internet was still trying to catch its stride. Nowadays, we have everything on our smartphones right at our fingertips, but back in the prequel era, we were still going to the bookstores and purchasing incredible publications written by David West Reynolds, who was officially a Lucasfilm professional, brought on board by George Lucas and crew after they saw an article he wrote for Star Wars Insider about the archaeology of Star Wars, the lost locations, the lost filming locations. And George was ramping up to do the prequels, and he wanted to go back to some of those original locations, but the paperwork and records on all of those places were lost to time. Nobody thought to really save all that information back in the 70s. And that's why David West Reynolds
probably rolled it up and smoked it back in the 70s.
Well, I was kind of leaning in that direction too. What could have been happening in the 70s?
Well, what happened to all those records
same thing that's
on the
happening.
Locations? Man, I don't know.
Oh, dude, it was probably that guy with the pink shorts who held the boom mic. I blame him for all of it. Something tells me him and his shenanigans were no good for the record keeping of the location shoots. But David West Reynolds went back to Tunisia and he hunted them all down. And this was before anyone was thinking about doing things like that. There certainly weren't tours, guided tours going on that would take fans out to the Lars Homestead location and all of that. No, nobody knew where those locations were. But David West Reynolds, he hunted them all down. So he holds a very important place in Star Wars history. And through those books that he wrote, he developed a lot of the things, a lot of elements that are becoming more and more present in current Star Wars storytelling.
It's incredible how much of that encyclopedic information became part of the lore and storytelling devices and plot devices and things. So certainly a major contributor back when the slate was a little cleaner.
Right. It was a real frontier, a wilderness frontier that needed to be tamed. And it was guys like David West Reynolds. And he'll also tell us about some incredible Indiana Jones projects he's working on as well. So I'm looking forward to getting caught up with David West Reynolds. We haven't had him on the show since 2017. And that's kind of shocking and surprising. So I'm glad we're rectifying that this week. And he certainly is a friend of Rebel Force Radio. So David West Reynolds coming up in the Cantina later on. We do have to mention to everyone a little programming note that the weekly RFR will be off the air next year. Next week.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry. No, I'm not. Next
whole year?
No, we'll be coming at you hot and heavy in 2025.
Honey, book the vacation.
What a flub. But just a programming note, there's going to be no weekly RFR next week. We're taking the week off here on the weekly show. But there will be content at RFR on Patreon. A new episode of RFR Q&A will happen, along with the continuing adventures of Podcastus and Grando the Grand. RFR RPG returns with Game Master Matt Rashid. So that'll be happening on Patreon. Patreon.com/Rebel Force Radio is the place to go to get ad-free episodes of Rebel Force Radio, bonus podcasts, full show video, and access to an incredible community of Star Wars fans just like you. So hang out with us over there and support Rebel Force Radio at patreon.com/Rebel Force Radio. So look for the Q&A, look for RFR RPG, but don't look for the weekly show next week.
All right. Well, let's check in with the news.
I have good news for you, my lord.
That's good news.
Come closer, I have good news.
Well, good news. That's subjective. But we do have some news about the Rey film. And Jim, the guy that we lovingly refer to here on RFR as the Peaky Blinders guy, screenwriter Stephen Knight has, according to reports, left the production, the development of the Rey film. Stephen was the latest writer in a series of writers that have been attached to the Rey film that is going to be directed by Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy. This is disappointing because Stephen was coming with a lot of pedigree, and there was a lot of hype around him coming into this project. And once again, he joins a list of, unfortunately, too many great creatives that have attempted to contribute to the Star Wars universe. He's another one in the list that has been let go and moved on.
I have information that Stephen Knight turned in 4 drafts of the Rey film, and all of them were rejected. And don't forget, Stephen's the second writer hired to work on this. Well, there was a writing team prior to him. Damon Lindelof and Justin Britt Gibson were working on the project for at least a year. We heard there was a writers' meeting that took place at Star Wars Celebration Anaheim in 2022, and Damon and Justin were part of that. So we know the project goes back at least to that moment, which was, springtime 2022? And then a year later, in March 2023, it was announced Lindelof and Britt Gibson were off the project, and Stephen Knight had signed on. And then with the hiccup of the WGA writer's strike, that held things up a little bit. But apparently since then, Stephen has turned in plenty of drafts, and they've all been passed on. because I guess, I don't know. So you have to imagine that Lindelof and Britt Gibson, they probably turned in 1 or 2 drafts.
Sure. Yeah.
And then now, if the word that I'm getting is accurate, Stephen Knight turning in 4 drafts. So we're like at least 6 drafts on this film. Yeah. So 5 or 6 drafts, and it still is not going into production. And
no, it's important to point out, though, that Daisy Ridley has said that she was compelled to come back because of the story. So it would seem that there is still some story that is directing all this, guiding all of this, but they're just, these writers, for whatever reason, haven't really stuck the landing. But there's a story, according to Daisy Ridley.
Yes. And where'd that story come from? Probably the story group at Lucasfilm.
Or maybe out of that initial draft from Lindelof. Possibly. I think Lindelof was part of the original, I would assume, creative sessions that might have broken the story.
Who wrote the script that had Rey being played as an older woman by Helen Mirren?
Old Lady
Remember
Rey.
that one?
Yeah. Wasn't that
I think, was that a Lindelof script?
I feel like that was the Lindelof. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
No. There's you know what? No, there was the movie that is still up in the air, and who's the creative that's attached to that? Because that was like, could this be related to the Rey movie? Could
You're talking about Sean Levy?
Levy. I believe isn't that the old lady Rey idea?
Boy, I can't remember.
We're losing
track
of these things.
I shouldn't have brought that up without knowing the answer myself. It just suddenly hit me.
It's all right. We're talking about a list that includes guys like Lord and Miller, Colin Trevorrow, Benioff and Weiss, Patty Jenkins, Justin Simeon, Josh Trank, Stephen Schiff, J.D. Dillard and Matt Owens, Damon Lindelof. The names just keep piling up, the bodies.
Yeah. You left off a big one. You left off a big one, George freaking Lucas.
Oh, that guy.
Ever hear of him? Ring any bells? But I just did some on-the-fly research. It was the Damon Lindelof concept, targeting Helen Mirren to portray the older version of Rey.
Okay.
So his scripts would have been quite a leap forward in the timeline. So they must have tightened it up to the place where Daisy Ridley was going to be featured as Rey.
Okay.
And Ridley was announced in April 2023 at Star Wars Celebration London. Then, by the end of 2023, it became obvious to Lucasfilm that the Rey film is not going to get off the ground and fill in one of the 3 previously released release dates for Star Wars films in 2026 and 2027. 2 in 2026, 1 in 2027. They needed something to fill that May 2026 slot, and they were banking on the Rey film. I honestly believe that. That's speculation on my part, but I feel strongly that that is the case. And so they fast-tracked a Mandalorian and Grogu film, which I'm going to just call the Grogu movie. No, I'm going to call it Baby Yoda, the movie. That's how I'm going to refer to it from now on.
That's so vintage. I love that.
Baby Yoda, the movie. Move over, Superman, the movie. There's a new The Movie hitting movie screens, and it's Baby Yoda, the movie. But so now we get a Mandalorian movie, which I'm really looking forward to, and I think that's great. So where does the Rey film land? If they're going to find a whole new writing team to get behind this thing, or do they just need to tweak a concept? I'm not really sure. But with the pace that this thing is going at right now, as we're creeping up on 2025, and obviously things are going to stall in Hollywood for a month and a half or so because of the holidays. So not much is going to be going on as far as developing this film. And it leads me to believe that the Rey film is not going to fill any of the previously announced Star Wars film release slots for 2026 or 2027. So I think, arrival of the Rey film is at least 2028 or beyond.
Sure. By the time they get this thing done, Daisy Ridley will be the age of Helen Mirren. And you won't even have
an older
to
Ray movie, whether they like it or not.
Geez. Yeah. It's frustrating, and I keep trying to figure out whether or not it's our proximity to this, the fact that Star Wars is such a high-profile property, and therefore all of the behind-the-scenes machinations are more known, more public, there's more interest, and maybe this is just par for the course. But, Jim, our friends that we have on the inside say that this is really unprecedented, this body count that Star Wars has been racking up. Yes, there are reshoots. Yes, there are rewrites. Yes, there are production issues and problems and people that get moved off of projects. But this is, for one franchise to have this much turmoil, that's not typical.
You would have thought there'd be some sort of resolution of these differences they keep having with these creatives. I don't know why that sort of thing is so difficult to negotiate. But it's not been a good track record, and fan apathy has become a little more apparent, and mainstream news outlets are starting to take note of this.
Yeah.
And I'm just really keeping my fingers crossed that we're a month away for a big smash hit for Star Wars being Skeleton Crew. Yeah. I just really hope the reaction to that is good, and I hope the quality is there to meet Star Wars fan standards. But it's troubling, to say the least, with all the false starts and stops. And then I question the whole idea of making these announcements so publicly, widely publicized at events like Star Wars Celebrations. Is this just merely to drive up the price on Wall Street of the Disney stocks? Because if there's no substance to these announcements, then we're talking, real serious stuff.
Yeah. It feels like it. It feels as though the shareholders know about these big events happening within fandom and within the industry, and so there was, I think, those were just as much PR moments for the corporation as it was for the fans, if not more so. Like, hey, we're a good bet, we're a good investment. We've got all these Star Wars movies on the horizon. And now I think every time they announce something, which I got to give them credit, they've cooled their jets on that. We haven't had this cavalcade of announcements like we had in several years ago, because it would just be rim shots, after each announcement. I mean, we talked about
bump,
but the one person that we've not heard from in a long time about this Rey film, because we keep hearing from Daisy, because Daisy's out. She's got other projects, so she gets asked the question, is Charmin Obaid-Chinoy. Remember Charmin showed up on a New Year's Eve special on CNN talking about her Star Wars project. So she was out there sort of claiming her territory as being the first female to have I forget how she worded it, but a significant
to tell
role.
A Star Wars story.
To tell a story, first female to tell a Star Wars story. Meanwhile, Patty Jenkins is like, "Hey, I'm over here. I thought I was the first."
And you know what? Patty might actually beat her to the starting line.
Wouldn't that be crazy?
Because there are 3 dates that need to be filled: May 2026. December 2026 and May 2027, or is it a December 2027? I can't remember, but sometime in 2027. So we know for sure that Mando and Grogu, Baby Yoda the movie, is going to be taking place May 2026. That's when it's going to hit the theaters. And I think that was originally flagged to be the release of the Rey film. But all the turmoil has ensued. And then there's the birth of the Jedi, The Dawn of the Jedi, Birth of the Force, whatever you want to call it. That's coming from James Mangold. Some reports are saying that they're really ramping up this project, and production might kick in full gear in 2025 at some point. So that would earmark it for the December slot, 2026, I'm sure, if they can get it in front of cameras early in 2025.
And that is a flip from what many people thought that December 2026 was going to be the Rey film.
Right.
And then December
and then you
2027 would have been the Mangold.
So then you have Rogue Squadron, which apparently still has a heartbeat at Lucasfilm. And apparently Patty Jenkins is still attached to that based on the most recent reports we've heard.
Yeah.
So could that take the 2027 slot? It very well could. And then Charmine is going to have to be satisfied with second female in the director's chair. I don't care who's in the director's chair. I think it's great that Patty Jenkins and Charmine Obaid-Chinoy is going to be in that chair. Well, I'd say yes for Patty because she has the major blockbuster experience. She's worked with special effects heavy productions, and she's worked with bajillion-dollar productions. Wonder Woman. Mm-hmm. So I think she has the edge. And Charmine might have all the potential in the world, but she has never been in charge of anything close to the massive budget and production of a Star Wars film. Ms. Marvel, maybe that was a good training ground, but it still isn't Patty Jenkins type pedigree stuff.
Yeah. One of the last updates we had about the Patty Jenkins was that she had finalized a new deal with Lucasfilm, and they were waiting on a script, a new draft of the script. And the thing that I loved about the Jenkins project was her connection to her father being a fighter pilot in the military or in the Air Force, and so she kind of understood what it was like to some degree to be somebody like that who was putting her life on the line and doing all of these crazy things. So I thought that I liked that personal connection that she had to it. Seemed like it was not just another gig; it really was a passion project. But it seemed like it went south pretty quick. I mean, they even cut a sort of a teaser, if you remember, where she was putting on the X-Wing helmet and getting into the X-Wing. You know,
I think she was rollerblading, wasn't she?
I don't remember that. But there was all, hey, these teasers. There was almost a teaser that was shown at Star Wars Celebration. I can't remember which one, but for the Boba Fett movie, they had something filmed for that. Right. And they, at the last minute, they pulled. I think was that the Josh Trank Boba Fett.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And so Josh went off the deep end. Fantastic Four was a flop, so that really damaged his reputation, and at Lucasfilm, and I think that of Simon Kinberg as well. So those guys got bounced, and the production budget for that film then went into the Solo film. Solo, a Star Wars story.
Yes.
To be proper about it. But
how that
looking toward the future, though, I have a lot more faith in the James Mangold film being the second film of 2026, and that's purely for the fact that he's releasing his Bob Dylan film this December.
I finally saw the trailer for that because you had mentioned it before, and it looks great. It really does. It's a very convincing Bob Dylan. Sometimes these biopics are hit or miss, but this one looks good. And I got to tell you, I did not hate the last Indiana Jones film. I kind of enjoyed myself through it. I liked it much more than Crystal Skull. So Mangold showing up doing a Star Wars, I'm there for it.
And what really helps his cause is, he's going fresh starting 2025 after a complete unknown, which is the Bob Dylan film gets released. But he's got Beau Willimon in the writer's room right now, working on this thing. And Bo, of course, known for House of Cards, but more importantly to us as Star Wars fans, he was one of the top dogs writing the Andor series, worked on at least 6 episodes. And every interview I heard with Tony Gilroy, Tony was singling out Bo Willimon as the guy who really was the MVP of that writer's room. So now he's going to be working on the Birth of the Jedi film. That's very promising. So I am betting that the James Mangold, the film, will go in front of cameras, hopefully by spring 2025, because they have to meet that December date. That's only a year and a half after spring 2025. So maybe they'll get going on it in January. Who knows? Because the clock is ticking.
For sure. Well, the clock is also ticking as we're counting down the really just the weeks at this point. We've got Skeleton Crew showing up, and Jude Law, who's going to be pretty much the team captain there as far as the cast. I mean, this is a bona fide movie star. He's been talking about his character and the series with the folks over at Variety. And Jim, this one is, I feel like in some ways, Skeleton Crew is sort of like the black sheep of the Disney Plus family. I don't know why I feel that way, other than to say, obviously, The Mandalorian, that was the first, and it was a huge hit. Boba Fett, there was a lot of excitement, a lot of hype for it, and it did all right, but I think it was still sort of coasting on some of the fumes of The Mandalorian. And then you got Kenobi. That was a huge deal with Ewan McGregor coming back to the fold as Obi-Wan Kenobi. Ahsoka, my gosh, there was so much excitement about that because that character had become so endeared in Star Wars fans' hearts. And then the Acolyte, it was like, oh my goodness, we're gonna look at this saga through the lens of a Darksider and all of that. So each one of these things sort of had its own reason, I guess you could say, reason for being. I'm not finding that with Skeleton Crew. So that actually makes me more intrigued. The fact that it doesn't necessarily have this reason for happening. Like, why is this show happening? Other than what I'm hoping for is they got a really cool, interesting story to tell.
Didn't some Star Wars TV show fall through the cracks, necessitating the need to reshift focus? I think it had something to do with, I don't know, Cara Dune? Rangers of the New Republic, anyone? Yeah. So they needed something.
Oh, so they had a budget. A substitute for Rangers. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And Jon Favreau, being the connected guy he is, had a good relationship, a working relationship with John Watts, the Spider-Man director, and the two of them hatched this whole story. And then they get Jude Law attached to it. So I think the reason for being might be it's a vehicle for Jude Law. And let's just see how the chips fall, how the cards fall on the table or whatever. So whatever that saying is. What is the saying, Swank? See the cards, how they fall, the chips, I don't know.
The chips fall where they may, right? Is that what it is?
Chips fall. Right. You can see how much time I spend at the poker table, which is zero. One time I sat down with my cousin, and he started with the cards and stuff, and it was my turn to shuffle.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, that was pretty embarrassing. I did it like a little kid does it on the table, where I just sort of, kind of rub the cards all over the table.
It's all new-sided, Jimmy Mack. We haven't heard. So Jimmy Mack is not the card shark.
I'm not a card. No,
is he
I'm
playing
not a
the
card
long game, and he's just waiting for the next time that you're at a Star Wars event and Mac is there, and you remember, oh, Mac, he's not so good with the cards, and you're like, hey, want to play a few hands? But he's really
they'll pull out
really a shark.
They'll pull out the Sabak cards. Ooh, let's keep it in universe, Swank.
That back, yeah. Sorry, Sabak. Smart.
I can't shuffle those either.
Let's go through some of these quotes here we got from Jude Law, from the Variety, this article. So the character name, Jod Na Nawood. Man, I really stumble over this every time. Will there be a day where I'll just go, yeah, Jod Na Nawood?
Maybe. I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Jump off the tongue? I think
you will be able to wrap your linguistics around his name. John, see, I can't. I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to shuffle these cards over here.
They're calling him a possible Jedi in this. I feel that the Jedi leaked maybe a little bit too early, so they're kind of backing off this. So I don't know. He might be a Jedi. He might not be a Jedi. Could be force sensitive, might not be force sensitive, but
it's heavily implied in the trailer.
I would say
that he is a Jedi.
Yeah.
Heavily implied when he force grabs that keychain or whatever. They're in a jail.
Yes, he gets the key for the cell. Yeah. So apparently Jude Law was a consultant on the character. He weighed in on some critical elements of his character. For instance, he refused to do what he calls acting with a carpet. Now, what is he talking about? Is he talking about a walking carpet like Carrie Fisher?
He's got to think about Wookiees. They always upstage him, so he won't work with them.
I don't work with animals, children, or Wookiees.
Not necessarily in that order.
So, we'll see what that's about. We can speculate. So
I know what that means.
I know what that means. Okay, what does that mean?
It means they approached him with a wig. If you look at Jude, he sort of has a receding hairline, like
it happens to the best of us here a little bit.
Some of us 50-somethings run into these issues, and so they came at him with a wig. Oh. And Jude said, "No way, man. You can take those luxurious locks and stick them where the sun doesn't shine. I'm Jude Law, and I'm going out there wigless."
Wonder if they presented him with that Luthen wig. You remember Luthen when he would play the sort of affected relics dealer, and he would have have the locks.
Just make it a recurring theme in all Star Wars stories. Our heroes are going to reach for their blasters, their lightsabers, and their toupees.
It's all the same wig, too. That's what I like.
Yeah. Gaffy stick resistant.
Yeah, so apparently they said, you're going to wear a wig. We want lovely tousled hair. And he goes, Jude said, no, I think you should have really short hair. He wears a helmet. Apparently it took some persuasion and they just let him go au naturel. And I like that because that, to me, when I see this photo that we're looking at here, and you can see it too, if you're on the all access tier of Rebel Force Radio on Patreon, this is Jude Law to me. This is Jude Law. And I think if you put the wig on it, it's almost like you put a wig on him, you're trying to almost obscure the fact that it's Jude Law. I think they want to lean into the fact that you got a big star like Jude Law in a Star Wars television series.
Yeah, and I think he's more comfortable approaching the role naturally himself.
Right.
I think there's a lot of his character based on Jude as a person, as an individual. And if he did have contributions made to developing the character, that would only be natural. That's why I think this is going to be a strong acting vehicle for him.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, I say acting, but he's probably just going to be himself in the Star Wars universe. So.
Yeah. This next one, I thought, my God, I hope Paul Bateman is listening. This was incredible.
Yeah.
He's talking about, the costumes and all that, and he says it has to go through the Star Wars filter. He says, there are no buttons in Star Wars. Now, how many times have we heard our buddy Paul Bateman talk about no zippers, no buttons? You don't see how the fabric fastens upon itself. And he says, there are no buttons in Star Wars, only ties, Buckles? Yes. Velcro? Yes. Although I don't think you ever see any Velcro. This is Jude Law talking about it. I'm trying to think. Now, Star Trek, man, you watch the original Star Trek, every time Kirk or Spock, they take their communicator, their phaser off themselves, you hear the of the Velcro.
The Velcro sound.
The Velcro was very important in the Star Trek universe. I'm trying to think about, Velcro might be used in Star Wars costumes, but it's not a device. It's that you don't ever hear it. You don't really see it. It's sort of, if it is being used, it's not obvious. Put it that way.
Yeah. You know, when Kirk would be sitting in the captain's chair and maybe the Enterprise took on a barrage of missiles from a Klingon vessel and it shook everyone up. And then they get thrown. There's an explosion. One of those panels explode and then people get thrown. And then Kirk comes up in his chair. And there's this flap on his uniform in the movies that comes loose all the time. One time, even in those Trek movies, it was open and there was blood smeared on it.
Yeah. Right.
So, and even in Star Wars, it happens to Luke in Return of the Jedi during the Vader duel on board the Death Star. His little flap comes open, and he even has it's like, oh, look, the interior is kind of a light gray compared to the outside, which is all black. That's really interesting. But that was like in the 80s, the best way to show your sci-fi heroes were under a lot of fatigue and they were under attack. They're going through a lot of stress. The situation is dire because that little flap on their uniform comes undone. You know, I might get a shirt with that. And then during RFR or whatever, maybe there's a heated debate about between me and Billy Mack about whether or not Mace Windu was attempting a coup when he walked into Palpatine's office. Because me and Billy did get in a heated debate about that. And then right in the middle of the show, you'll see the flap will be open on my shirt. It'll be like, ooh, man, this is a tense podcast.
Did you see Mac had the flap open on his shirt? That it's a thing now. You rip it. I love because Shatner, he pulls it, he tugs it, and he opens it as if, trying to get some air.
He's trying to cool off a little bit.
But, I never thought of the comparison between the Shatner flap in Wrath of Khan and Luke's flap in Return of the Jedi. You're damn right. And those movies were only about a year apart.
Yes.
In production. ILM, did the effects on both of those films. So, coincidence?
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for these meetings. Well, how do we show the audience that the characters are under a lot of stress and this is a dire situation? Well, duh. Just pull the Velcro on that flap and let it fly. Then our 80s superstar heroes are under a lot of duress. So, this is really worth discussing, and I'm glad we're breaking the ceiling on this discussion here, and we're breaking through, and we're getting to the bottom of it.
I just did a little Google search here. Shatner bloody flap, and
that might turn up some really.
Yeah, I don't want to really.
Yikes!
I don't want to break the fourth wall too much here and show you what just came up on my. Don't do that. Okay,
don't want to see
one more quote here from Jude Law. He says there are certain shots they don't allow you to do if you're the director. You can't pass through the glass of the spaceship. You have to stay on the outside or the inside. I love that. You see the shot and you go, oh, I'm in Star Wars. So you can't pass through the glass of the spaceship. You have to stay on the outside or the inside. So I'm wondering if what he's talking about there is in sci-fi, sometimes there are shots where you see the camera start from outside of the ship and it comes in, and then you see what's happening on the inside. That happens a lot in Star Trek. You might see Picard drinking his Earl Grey tea through the window, or one of the port windows of his quarters, and then it sort of sweeps in. And I feel like maybe Jude's saying that doesn't work in Star Wars. Either you're on the outside of the ship or you're the inside of the ship. You don't see the camera sort of breaking that barrier between the two.
I'm scraping my memory, trying to think of a time when live-action Star Wars actually violated that rule. And I'm thinking about The Last Jedi. I just am seeing those shots when Kylo Ren was attacking Leia's ship and he was in his TIE fighter. I could swear there was like some sort of, or a J.J. Abrams shot. I'm thinking purely prequels right now.
You mean sequels?
I'm sorry, sequels. There's always so many quills now. I can't keep track of them all. But also, like maybe an animation. I'm thinking about some shots. I'm trying to think of, like, what did Kyle Newman complain about when we were doing the old Clone Wars roundtables? And because Kyle would say things like, "Oh, that shot, no,
Yeah,
no."
right.
He would look at that stuff, and he always does. And but just nothing is really jumping to my attention right now. So if you know out in the listening audience of a moment when in live action or even animated Star Wars where this rule was violated about passing through glass on a starship, let us know. Show at rebelforceradio.com.
Rebel Force Radio.
Okay, without further ado, why don't we head off into the cantina and check in with our pal, David West Reynolds.
Star Wars Cantina.
Where are you going, Master? For a drink.
Sorry about the mess.
You will never find the more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
Hey, David.
Hey,
David.
It's great to hear from you and see you. Welcome back to Rebel Force Radio. It's been a minute.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back. I thought we would have talked before now, but hey, we've both been busy people. All of us have been busy people.
Yeah,
true.
Well, catch us up with you. What have you been up to lately?
Well, okay. So, and you can cut these things out, right?
I sure can. Yeah.
Good, okay.
You let us handle all that stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
We have the razor blades and the machine. Our razor blades are a little rusty, you got to understand, but we cut anyway.
So in the last several years, I kind of started to re-engage with the Star Wars legacy that I was a part of, because I've been away from it for a long time doing other things. So I've been on icebreaker missions in the high Arctic and working with the U.S. Naval Sea Systems Command on radar invisible ship Sea Shadow and crazy stuff like that. But it was time to come back and check on what had happened with the seeds that I planted with Star Wars. And this partly started happening because Roger Christian got in touch with me and wanted to have me work with him on the documentary that he was making, Galaxy Built on Hope, that tells the whole story of his memoir that he wrote in Cinema Alchemist, which is his record of all of his memories of working on Star Wars and also Alien. And I had convinced him that he needed to write that book. And after he'd written the book, I said, that's great. Now I want to see the documentary. And finally, he was convinced that people wanted to hear those stories too. So once he got the funding put together and was going to make a show, he got in touch with me and said, hey, I would like to interview you and have you in the documentary. And that just brought Star Wars back into my radar. And I started checking in around and talking to people at shows again and talking with Roger about a lot of things. And that's what made me interested again, and started me talking about all of those things. So I started giving speeches. I started appearing in conventions again, and realizing that there were a lot of questions that people had that because I was away from it for so long, I hadn't been around to answer about the things that I had created about the lightsabers and how I picked up directly from Roger's work and how his work was specifically so influential on the directions that I then took the lightsaber when I had that unique window of opportunity in the late 90s and early 2000s at Skywalker Ranch to tap into what I thought was the the pure original spirit of Star Wars and try to revitalize that as the prequel trilogy got launched. So lightsabers become important to me again. And so that was one side of things. And then the other side is, at this stage in my life, I've wanted to share with people, because I'll give Star Wars talks or Indiana Jones talks, and at the Q&A, people always say, how did you get to do all these different things? Archaeology and paleontology, named different species of dinosaurs, and all this crazy different stuff, NASA and Coast Guard. And that's what I want to share, because that's actually the most powerful legacy of Star Wars in my life, because all of those things were possible because George told us a hero's journey story in the first Star Wars movie that he made. And that impressed me so deeply that that's what gave me the guidance and the courage to go find my inspiration and seek my fortune. And that's what took me to Tunisia and eventually to Skywalker Ranch. So what I talk about now is the hero's journey. And so I give talks about that, and we can talk about where that's gone if you like, but I'm sharing that with people now, the hero's journey, and how these things that we enjoy as entertainment, how we can tap into that more deeply and enrich your life that way. Not just entertain yourself, but become the person that you dream of being, that sometimes you see facets of who that person is that you want to be in this entertainment that we love. And that's because it's calling to you.
Well, it certainly sounds like you're on something of your own hero's journey right now. And I think that's great. You know, actually, the connection between you and Roger Christian actually came from Rebel Force Radio. It was Roger who heard you on our show, and Roger reached out to me and asked me for your contact information. And that was the last I heard of it. So I'm so happy to find out that through a connection made on Rebel Force Radio, you guys have really cultivated something super cool. And especially when you're talking about a lightsaber, which Roger created for the original Star Wars film. He's the guy who actually built the actual first lightsaber hilt. And it's a very famous story about how he took a flash bulb handle from an old camera and put a bunch of doodads on it and greeblies, and the next thing you knew, it was a lightsaber. But you had mentioned to me prior to this interview that in working with Roger and via your collaborations, there is lightsaber lore that has kind of been resurfacing, and you've never really made that public before now. So can you give it? Yeah, and also just one more thing. I know this is long-winded, but you're the guy who came up with the concept for the crystal within the lightsaber hilt. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, it is.
Yeah, that was in the Star Wars cross-sections book from 20-something years ago. Not to date any of us, but it's classic. I mean, it's grown into so many things. It's become part of the storytelling. They sell little replicas of those crystals at places like Galaxy's Edge. So tell us about this journey with the lightsaber that you guys have been on.
Well, I'd be glad to, and it's so appropriate that this is happening on Rebel Force Radio, because that was a seed that you planted with getting me back together with Roger after I'd been away from things, because I worked with his legacy before I knew him personally. Then I knew him at Skywalker Ranch and working on the prequels. But after I'd been away with it, you brought us back together. So this is a story about planting seeds and where that leads. And you're absolutely a part of that. So I'm really glad to be sharing this story here.
I'm like the R2-D2 in this situation. I rolled up on you guys and showed you a hologram of Roger Christian. And Roger was saying, help me, David West Reynolds. You're my only hope.
The truth is stranger than fiction sometimes, right? So, okay. So let's see. Where we'll start is, so do you know what the very first lightsaber prop was?
The old bulb handle for a camera.
Okay, now you're talking to it's a good thing you're talking to the archaeologist of Star Wars, because we can go back farther than that.
Okay.
We can go back, and if you look at Ralph McQuarrie's production paintings, So early on, when the script was still in flux, and George knew that he wanted a laser sword. That was part of his vision for Star Wars. A laser sword goes back pretty far in his development. But early on, the stormtroopers carried these laser swords as well as everyone else. They were just, that was the weapon that was used in this world rather than a gun. There you go. Now, if you look closely at the weapon that Stormtrooper is holding and that the Proto Han Solo character is holding in the background, you'll see that's a one-handed weapon. So what you have here is the equivalent of a rapier. Now, I used to use a rapier when I was fencing. And so this is background that I put into the development of the lightsabers when that became my job. But you see that one-handed dueling weapon there, and those were made as props in the special effects department in England, which is not the same as Roger's set decorating department. They were made, I think it was under John Steers, and they lathe turned, and you can see in some of Ralph's pictures, if you look at the production painting of Luke tackling Darth Vader on the early version of the blockade runner, and you see the lightsaber that Luke is holding, it's one of these one-handed rapier-type weapons. So that was the clearest vision anybody had for what a lightsaber would look like. And John Steers, yes, there it is, okay? Now that is what the special effects department, and by special effects I mean the on-stage special effects, that's what they had to go on. Well, they produced these things. They I think it was lathe turned out of metal. They look just like what you see in Ralph McQuarrie's image there, and they were boring. They were not interesting. They were not threatening. Everybody looked at them and said, it's a flashlight. It has to be romantic. It has to have adventure, some sense to it. You know, even a classic Three Musketeers rapier, you know, they've got some style around the hilt. These simple devices based on Ralph McQuarrie's design, in Ralph McQuarrie's paintings, they didn't have to look cool themselves because Ralph's paintings are full of action and vitality and color. The actual lightsaber prop didn't need to look great, but once you get this into 3 dimensions, in our world, the copy of his design looked completely uninspiring. And so those were the first lightsaber props made. When Roger turns his attention to the lightsabers, he looks at those and just thinks, that's not going to work. So it's because they ended up irrelevant in the long-term part of the story that's why that hasn't been something that has been shared, because Roger looked at it and rightly decided that's just not it. That direction is not going anywhere. I have to come up with something completely different than that because it's not going to inspire anybody. So thank heaven, Roger took that upon himself to say, that's not going to work. We have to start over. So that's the original lightsaber prop. It just didn't get blessed by George.
Wow. I never knew that those actual props were created. And that's some really interesting information. What's also very cool is through the connection of you and Roger Christian. Roger's book, Cinema Alchemist, was provided with a foreword by George Lucas and one other guy who might actually be on this call. David, you did the foreword for his book.
And wasn't that an honor? I mean, Roger is just one of my favorite colleagues in the whole Star Wars universe because he inspired me so much. His work, I connected with that so powerfully when I first saw Star Wars. And I didn't know that this was the work of a guy named Roger Christian, but I knew that whoever had made those worlds seem so real, that was fascinating to me because that person had a sensibility. He instinctively understood layers of history. And so when I went on into archaeology and learned close looking and interpreting all of the signs that humans leave about all of the things that we do and the things that we make, and I learned to study and interpret those, it was the same kinds of patterns that I'd seen in Star Wars, which is a completely artificial world, but it looked that real because Roger's sense of reality is that strong. So I love getting to work with him, and getting a chance to write that forward was a pleasure. I had no idea that I would end up billed right after that guy we've all heard of named George Lucas. So that's I enjoy that back cover very much.
So David, how did you go from sort of being the guy that brought us closer to the physical locations, your contribution to the lightsaber, all very tactical, to now being the guy that's talking about the more, I guess, the spirit of the story with the hero's journey. Did you just kind of grow tired of the archaeology of it and want to dig a little bit deeper into maybe a little bit more of the metaphysical?
It's a great question. Thank you. I've shared my experience of Star Wars in the talks that I've given. I've written articles too, so you may have seen things in Star Wars Insider and places like that. And I enjoy sharing that with people. But like I mentioned, it's in the Q&A sections after the talks that I give, or when I get to meet people at conventions and I hear what their questions are, or what's interested them, or what's on their mind, that it very often came around to, that's great, and now I finally understand what you meant about why you invent the crystals or what that means. But they would want to know, how did you get to Skywalker Ranch from being an archaeologist? And when you got to Skywalker Ranch, I hear all these stories about how you kept breaking all of these boundaries and breaking the rules, and what made you feel like you could get away with that and not get fired. And they ask these questions so often that I realized I wanted to share the technical specifics of the history of Star Wars with them, and I would see it in their eyes when they get new stories or new insights, and I love giving that to them. But I could serve people better by tapping into more deeply what makes you come up with the idea of going location hunting when no one has ever done that before. And doing something like that no one's done it before, it's completely different than following the path that someone else has made. So when I went to seek those locations in Tunisia, no one had ever heard of anyone going to look at filming locations for any reason, much less finding lost ones. And so as soon as I get back, though, and the article gets published in the Insider, lots of people say, oh, I was going to go to Tunisia too. Yeah, I was about to do that too. But, then you went and did it first. But, I was going to do that too. And of course, physically, anyone could have done it. They could have done it anytime, all those years. But it's when someone changes the zeitgeist by actually showing that something can be done, and that they're willing to be the person that everyone says is crazy, that what you're setting out to do is foolish, it's pointless, and the person who will do it anyway under those circumstances, that's the bigger challenge than the physical one. And to explain why I was prepared to do that took explaining the myth of Star Wars and how A New Hope was a map for my life. And I ended up doing coaching, which is what came out of this. So on this side, people would come to me and say, well, I've got this challenge and you seem to have gotten through all these things. What can you say to help me get through my challenge? I was very sick for many years and unconscious most of the time. And I built my life back after getting through that. So, I've been through things like that, as well as the big, high points like working on Star Wars with George Lucas. So I realized that it's the myth of Star Wars that's even more powerful. And so I'm not tired of the details at all. I love it. And it was speaking on stage with Roger this year that we uncovered a major aspect of lightsaber lore, just live between the two of us. So I'm still very excited about that sort of thing. But it's the hero's journey aspect of Star Wars that I'm putting more of my energy into now, because I see how empowering that is for people. That there's lots of people who love Star Wars and engage in it in very strong ways. They're collectors, they're cosplayers, or game players. But when I say there's a whole deeper level that you can go to in your engagement with this, and let me show you how I did that. Look what it's done for my life. And it's just because George Lucas was telling the truth in A New Hope. That's not just a fantasy, it's a myth, and that's a completely different thing.
You mentioned that you and Roger had a revelation about lightsaber lore. Is that something you can share with us?
Because this is Rebel Force Radio, yes, I will share. So we're on stage. It's actually, Roger came to a museum exhibition about the hero's journey and about my career. It was Star Wars meets Indiana Jones, the hero's journey of Dr. David West Reynolds, which is, I love that title. They did a museum exhibition on my career, and more than half of it was about my Star Wars work. And Roger came down to speak and do signings. And we were on stage talking about lightsabers because that's what the fans were asking about. And I was explaining how the original one-handed weapon would have been so much less romantic than the two-handed weapon that Roger came up with. And so he was telling his Graflex story. And then they were saying, well, how did you come up with the idea to do the crystals? And I explained that story, which we can get into if you want to hear about that. But then they heard that I had invented the whole idea that each Jedi builds their own lightsaber. And that is a major milestone in a Jedi's career. The test of their force sensitivity is, can you align that crystal with that incredibly dangerous power source so that the first time you turn on that lightsaber, you produce that arc wave blade instead of an explosion. And that this is a major Jedi ritual. So all of that was material that I created for the first Star Wars visual dictionary. When I came to the ranch and was going to be writing about all this, the lightsaber was just a weapon like a Colt 45 or an M16 that you bought from a factory. And different people had different makes. He's got a Mauser C96 broom handle, and he's got a Luger. But they were just weapons that you bought at a factory. And I thought, I do not want that. I do not want that. How can there be something that makes a lightsaber like a samurai sword? Because George is drawing his inspiration from Kurosawa films, and then that whole samurai aesthetic informs the whole nature of the Jedi. How can their lightsabers be in tune with that? Because a samurai sword was something really special. Only certain people even knew how to make a samurai sword. It was very difficult. It involved special techniques, and sometimes certain techniques would be lost for generations, and a blade would get handed down because these are so special. So how do I give that quality to a technological object? And that's why I came up with the crystals, an organic element. When I was trying to do this at the ranch, people were saying, well, it's impossible because the lightsaber is a piece of technology. So once you've got a device, anyone can copy that device. So your idea is not going to work. And I thought about this, about how do you put an organic element? And I thought it's naturally occurring crystals. That's what's going to be that organic element. And then if it's naturally occurring, it's only force sensitivity because it's too subtle for even a computer to align. And so that's where that came from. And so I don't know, is that part of the story? Is that part well known?
Well, I think so. I think so. But I wanted to follow up to that and ask if you had anything to do with or what your feelings are about this idea of bleeding a lightsaber when it comes to Sith. And we saw it finally in live action in the latest Star Wars series, The Acolyte. So your thoughts about that? And do you have any fingerprints on that?
Definitely not on that. So what I learned from George at Skywalker Ranch was that Star Wars is not a science fiction universe. It's not even just a fantasy universe. It's a mythic universe. And that's a different thing altogether. In science fiction, you can make up anything. You can get into time travel and very esoteric problems that have, when you have time travel, do you go back and prevent the assassination of so-and-so? And you can get into very interesting stories. But the function of a myth is to present stories where the people have choices to make that are going to be like the choices that you and I have to make. So a mythic universe has to echo our universe. Things have to work in the same ways. And that's why George said, everything in Star Wars, if it's built right, is an echo of something in our world. And I listen when he says things like that. I don't just let that go past. He says something like that in an interview or where he's talking to people in the art department, and I think, okay, that is a direct insight into how he creates his Star Wars material. That's a major filter that now tells me which ideas is he going to feel are coherent with or are harmonic with the material that he has created, and what doesn't fit. And so that's, I think, my understanding of that is why I had this incredibly high batting average of George approving the material that I created, no matter how new or far out it was, because I respected the process that he told us that he used. It wasn't a secret, but very few people seemed to get that, and they would just go in science fictional directions and make up any wild thing, which science fiction can be very entertaining. But the function of a myth is entertainment wrapping truth. And truth is always going to be something that's relevant in our world.
Yeah.
Wow. You know, I draw parallels to your approach to Star Wars and George's approach to Star Wars in a similar fashion to how Ben Burtt created a lot of the audio sounds of Star Wars, where he used very organic sounds, like an elephant roar. And then he'd combine that with a few other things, like tires on a wet road. And he created the sound of the TIE fighter flying by. It was always that approach, as opposed to taking real electrical kind of sounds and synthesized sounds, which was so much of the way that science fiction was being produced back in the day, or anything futuristic, or, you know, laser guns. That kind of, it would always be more of an electronic sound. But Ben, he created the sound of the blaster by tapping a hammer on a radio tower wire. So it's the whole idea of combining the organic with the technology to create something that we on planet Earth can instantly relate to. Even if we don't know we're relating to it, it's kind of hits you on a subconscious level.
Exactly. I think that's actually a really good observation, because that's perfectly true. And it's the reason that we could go, I remember seeing the Star Wars for like the dozenth time and somebody saying, why do you want to see it again? Haven't you seen it enough? And I was trying to explain, I'm very young, and I'm saying, but even the sounds, like I can't remember the way the Star Wars universe sounds, and it's so distinctive, and I just feel enveloped by it when I go into the theater and see the movie again, because I didn't know there was a Ben Burtt then, but I felt the power of his work, and it was so enveloping and convincing because he went to the infinite richness of reality. Whenever you go to something like a synthesizer, there's a limit to its resolution, you might say. And it's like that with computer graphics, I feel. Like you can come up with a great formula for ocean waves or for clouds, and it looks very naturalistic, but the resolution is never going to be the infinite resolution of reality. Ben went to reality and then put his artistry on top of that and gave a sound that was worthy of George Lucas's mythic universe. And so that's why he deserved his special achievement Oscar, because he thought about sound in a new way. That was really epical. And I think you're absolutely right to say that that's an approach that was very much in harmony with what George was doing when he's going to history. With the stormtroopers have a cylinder on the back of their belts because the German stormtroopers in the 30s and 40s carried a canister back there. There are specific visual and structural harmonics that tie to real history. And so he's going to history and he's going to myth instead of just imagination. And that gave Star Wars a very distinct quality. And it was one of the first things I learned at the ranch. And so I kept that very much in mind with everything that I developed for the cross-sections books and the visual dictionary.
Speaking of Skywalker Ranch, you mentioned earlier you had a reputation as a rule breaker at the ranch. Maybe somebody who marches to the beat of his own drum. Can you expand on that a little bit?
I don't know the subsequent history of the ranch, but I don't know anyone else for whom they rewrote the ranch rule book twice because of me.
All right, we'll spill the beans.
The lawyers had to rewrite it, and then everybody's office, and the ranch minions would come around and they'd take your binder and they'd give you the new one because David West Reynolds has been causing trouble again. And
you don't seem, I got to say, David, for anyone watching or listening, you don't seem like a troublemaker. You seem like a pretty, pretty by the book type guy.
Well, appearances can be deceiving. Because what I was after, I wanted the best possible work. I wanted the best possible product for my readers. And so I didn't care what the rules were about what hierarchy we had to work through. Mm-hmm. And if I knew there's something in the archives that's going to help me make this the best piece, then I'm going to ask the person that'll get me into the archives and see those blueprints or handle that prop. And that just makes perfect sense. It shouldn't be that, well, you work in this building, and so that's not an archives access building. I ignored all of that and did whatever I thought was necessary to do the work well.
A true rebel.
This was my role. And other people would just look at me and say, you can't do that. But there were two reasons that I could get away with this. One was because let them fire me. I didn't try to get here. They came after me. So I'm an archaeologist. I just got a PhD. I was ready to go teach college, not come out to Hollywood. So let him fire me. I'll go back to teaching archaeology, no problem. And other people were just like, don't talk like that. It's upsetting to hear you even say that because, we're all so grateful to God that we're even here at the ranch, and we don't want to do anything that would jeopardize our job because, of course, it's a wonderful job and the whole community is wonderful and nobody wanted to lose it. I didn't want to lose it either, but I wasn't going to let it cramp my style just to suit some bureaucratic rules if I knew I could deliver the best product. So that's one reason is that I figured, fire me. I don't care. This was not what I set out to do. This is a wild, incredible surprise in my life. And factor number two is that I had a protective force field around me that would protect me against almost anything. And that was George's producer, Rick McCallum.
Very colorful character there.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I was only at the ranch because of Rick. So Rick brought me to the ranch, and once he had understood what has this guy got to offer, and he wanted me at the ranch, and once he understood this guy's a walking encyclopedia of the original films, and they're talking about making new reference books that will define canon, and he pointed out dozens of errors in one of the most recent reference books that we published. So that's unacceptable. He should be involved in these. And so it was Rick's behest that put me on those DK books because he'd seen that there were errors being made, that people didn't understand the film industry that were, editing some of these books and publishing mistakes. And I did understand both the film industry and the fictional universe. And Rick felt that I could be useful to the company. And so he was the one who convinced me to change my career path and come out there. And he had my back. Like, I couldn't misbehave and do something outrageous, like, take a copy of the script home, which that would have been disrespectful. I was never disrespectful of anything that deserved respect. It was just crazy rules that shouldn't be in the way in the first place. So as long as I was delivering record-breaking results with my website, or, I was the creative consultant on the trailer, and that did rather well. So as long as I'm making the company look good, I knew Rick had my back. And that was peace of mind when I was about to do some other crazy thing that was going to make people go berserk.
Yeah, and the results speak for themselves. The first trailer for The Phantom Menace probably goes down in history as one of the finest trailers ever produced for the Star Wars franchise. And it was really trend-setting in its time. And then these DK books. Oh, my God, I ate these alive. They were just so great. The pages are all falling out of them. And so look at this. Look at the page just falls right out because they were so used and just loved.
That makes me so happy.
Because the internet back then wasn't quite up to speed yet, and these books were so invaluable. And your research in the archives and the photos that you provided, along with the descriptions, I don't think the Star Wars franchise has matched the quality and depth of your books. And I'm such a huge fan. I'm just really appreciative of Rick McCallum for bringing you into the fold that way. And Rick and George, those guys were kind of no nonsense, a little bit of an anti-authoritarian edge to them from time to time. And I think they appreciated you doing what you had to do to get the job done.
I like to think so, and thank you very much for those comments. The way that I approached those DK books was one of the things that would have gotten me fired over and over if I didn't have that special background. And Rick, I'm serious. Like, one thing after another, I could list all these different controversies where, oh no, David West Reynolds is insisting again that we align the hold of the Millennium Falcon so that it's at right angles to the axis of the ship, because that makes more sense. But we've just commissioned this expensive poster that shows that it's off axis because the person doing the poster had the set blueprints where the set's not really built to fit in the real exterior because it's a movie set. And I came in and I would say, I'm sorry, we cannot publish the book with that kind of problem. And I would make these presentations, and it's like, he's this archaeologist, and so everything he presents all this evidence and all these reasons, and he cites chapter and verse, and Ralph McQuarrie did this, and when he finally says, well, and George has a line about this, and they're like, oh God, okay, fine, he gets his way on that one. That's how that would go.
That's great.
Was it getting a PhD and having to defend your dissertation? Do you think that is what made you so effective in a corporate environment like Lucasfilm, where you really had to prove your case?
Honestly, yes, because and I came to Lucasfilm fresh from defending my PhD, so I'd had to keep everything secret. It was a huge secret that I had sneaked off to Tunisia to find the sites, and that I had then published about this in Star Wars Insider, and then that I got hired by Lucasfilm to go back as a location scout. All of that was a secret, because if that had gotten out, I would not have gotten my degree from that program. They had threatened to throw me out for even speaking at a library and giving a public lecture on ancient exploration, because I thought this was cool. Roman centurions in search of the source of the Nile and Carthaginians finding volcanoes in equatorial Africa. I thought this was cool, and I wanted to tell the public about it. And they caught me, and I got hauled before the chairman of the program and was told, you keep this up and you're not going to finish this program. You know that, Reynolds. So if they had known, like, he's hunting Star Wars locations on another planet, I mean, I would have been totally history.
Wow.
So having just gone through that defense, when it came to, that if I had a point to make about, look, this is consistent. My colleagues were people like John Barry and Roger Christian and Ralph McQuarrie. I'd studied their work, and I was there, so I worked with NASA and did a history of the Apollo moon landings and worked with the astronauts that had walked on the moon and commanded Apollo missions. And they always talked about the unbroken chain. And that when people asked them, how did you accomplish the moon landings with technology of the 1960s? It's unbelievable that they did that. And if you knew the guys well enough to get them to the point where they would talk about what was real, they would say there was an unbroken chain of trust throughout Apollo, from the lowest technician to the head of the program, from the astronauts to the guy who tightens the bolts on the Apollo capsule hatch. There was an unbroken chain of trust, and we all trusted each other. And that's why we were willing to do these things, and that's why it was possible. And for me, as soon as I became part of the Star Wars world, I said, there's going to be an unbroken chain with me and my colleagues that I respect. And so this was one of the ways that I broke the rules, where if I had a question of, well, I wonder, why would the uniforms be like that? Well, I'm going to call John Marlowe, who designed the uniforms in the first place. And so I would make somebody give me John's contact information. And when it was my job to explain, okay, General Veer says all troops will debark for ground assault and Echo Base, right? How? How do troops get out of the snow walkers? We see in Return of the Jedi, how do people get out of the walkers? There's a giant gantry. Then you walk out of the side of the walker because there's a convenient gantry. did the rebels build a gantry so that the walkers could debark their troops and could come down the elevator and then shoot everybody? That's mighty obliging of everybody that you're going to attack if it takes them building a gantry. Oh my God, here come the walkers. Quick, build a gantry. The guys are going to fall if they just walk out of the walker. How did people get out of a walker? How did the troops disembark under combat conditions from the walker? Well, nobody knew. That's my job when it comes to the snow walker cutaway. Well, I say, well, I'm not just going to make this up. I'm going to go talk to the people who designed it. So I go down to ILM. Lauren Peterson, chief model maker. Lauren, how do people get out of the snow walker? And we talk about this stuff. And
now, I got to ask, though, David, I got to ask, was that something that a guy like Lauren Peterson had thought of, or was he just trying to make something cool? You know what I mean? The difference.
You're absolutely right. So in many cases, it was exactly as you say. And that happened all the time with Doug Chang. I'd say, Doug, why is there that bulge on the Federation control ship? And he'd say, because it looks cool. And I'd say, okay, I just needed to know. And you know why there's that bulge in above the docking bay, Doug? And he'd say, no, David, tell me. And I'd say, Doug, you put that there because there has to be a guiding tractor beam. Think of the ships coming into here, and if the danger of if the ship wasn't perfectly aligned, of course there has to be a tractor beam, and that's why you put that bulge there. It was brilliant, Doug. And he would say, wow, I love finding out how brilliant I am from all these explanations.
Now, see, you want to talk about brilliant, though. We have to pay tribute to Ralph McQuarrie, who, through his years as a technical illustrator for places like Boeing, he really was able to consider the practicality of his designs. And something like how would the troopers debark from the AT-AT, I'm surprised Ralph didn't have some sort of immediate answer to that.
And so you're absolutely right. And that's why I loved working with designs that Ralph had a part in, because he had such a strong NASA sensibility, an aerospace sensibility. So his designs always had that understanding of practicality that meant it was much easier for me to rationalize things that had come out of his imagination. So yes, you're absolutely right. And yet, when it got to that big question, I go through all these things. I'm talking through it with Lauren Peterson, and I say, so we're looking, there's the little door on the side of the walkers, and that's what we use in Jedi for them to come out, where Luke talks to Vader on the Endor gantry. And I said, so, but what do they do in combat? And Lauren said, David, there was a time when George was telling me what we needed to do with the models. And I said, well, what about this aspect, George? How do you want that? And he looked at me and he said, Lauren, that sounds to me like that's your job to figure out, and walked away. So when you ask me, David, how do people get out of this model that we built here at ILM? I'm going to look at you and say, David, that's your job. You figured that out.
Oh, I bet that felt so good for Lauren to finally be able to say to someone else.
Yeah. After George saying, oh, Lauren, that's a you problem, pal. And he just walks away. I have a song recommendation for you. I just wanted to make this recommendation in light of the passing at 84 years old of Grateful Dead bassist Phil Lesh. I'm a Deadhead, lifelong Deadhead, and one of his most well-known songs for the Grateful Dead is a song called Unbroken Chain. And I would like to recommend that song to you if you haven't heard it already.
I haven't. I'm so glad you mentioned that. I will look that up.
Yeah. Grateful Dead, Unbroken Chain. R.I.P. Phil Lesh.
Yeah, it's a great philosophy, and it's absolutely paramount to how those guys were able to achieve what they did back in that time, and it was that idea of trust in your colleagues and their competence and their abilities is something I think really to be marveled, and the fact that you've brought it with you all the way into your career at Lucasfilm and beyond is awesome. I do have a question, though, that I've been dying to ask you for I don't know how long during this interview, because you were talking about how George helped define myth, is that it's entertainment, it's truth wrapped in entertainment. I think that's a really, really great definition of it. and that there are things that science fiction can accomplish or do that mythology can't. Can we talk about the midichlorians? And you were there at the time. And midichlorians has been, kind of controversial amongst Star Wars fans. Some people love them, some people hate them. I have my own sort of retcon and why I felt it was needed at the time. But what's your take, David, on midichlorians and how it was? Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What's your take on midichlorians? Let's leave it at that.
Well, will you tell me your idea first? Like, I'm interested if you have a perspective on what kind of retcon.
My perspective is that at this particular time, the Jedi were over-reliant on technology and science as a way to sort of justify or explain things. And so they needed a way to measure someone's force sensitivity or force abilities. And that the midichlorians became a way that they could do that. But I always felt that there was a much deeper spiritual or metaphysical meaning behind all of that. That was just, again, an over-reliance on science and tech, which was part of their downfall.
I think that's a great insight. Like, that's the kind of thing that I would say, yeah, we could take that and run with that. So I can recognize like things that are good seeds that are going to lead somewhere productive but harmonic with the myth, and things that are just science fiction ideas that might be entertaining, but it's not about the truth. So I like what you've suggested there. When I first heard about midichlorians and had to deal with them and expanding the universe, I had to wrestle with that because it wasn't consistent with the way I had seen the Force. It felt to me like it was saying, listen, if you don't have the right blood, then you don't have any hope. If you don't have the right blood, if you didn't get born into the right family or the right place, you didn't get born with the right advantage, then your dreams are never going to come true. You're not one of the blessed. You're not one of the chosen ones. And if I had a myth like that to guide me, I never would have gone to Tunisia. I had the myth of New Hope, which was an ordinary kid from a nowheresville planet in the middle of nowhere, no connections, no money. And all he knew, he didn't even know what his direction was. He's looking at the sunset. He doesn't even know what he wants. He just knows that he wants something more than this. He wants to be somebody worthwhile, but he doesn't have a goal. He doesn't have a path at all. That was me. And this myth came along and told me, you're not alone in feeling that. See, this is not just you. You're not messed up. This is something that happens in life, that you can reach this point and you feel something incomplete in you. You feel something far away calling to you. You don't know what it is. You don't know how to get there. But if you feel that, you can have hope that you will get there. Let me show you how this works. And that's the rest of the story. The guy who starts out complaining, blaming other people for his problems, and turning down his chance for adventure when it comes to him. Oh, I can't get involved. I got to stay and help my uncle, blah, blah, blah. When that guy stops complaining, stops blaming other people for his problems, and takes responsibility and starts making some tough choices, his whole life blossoms and he becomes capable of doing everything that he ever dreamed of and more, and capable of doing things that no one around him thought he was capable of. That was the myth that Star Wars taught me. And I went out and lived it. I went out and lived it again and again. My Death Star trench, I understood that Luke's not teaching us to fire the proton torpedo at exactly the right moment and you'll blow up the Death Star. We're never going to have to blow up the Death Star, but we are going to have to believe in ourselves when everyone around us thinks, I don't think it's worth it. His project, his new business is going to fail. It's a terrible idea. His new podcast, he thinks he's going to do a Star Wars podcast. There's a bunch of others. It doesn't make sense. It's not going to work. And when other people around you don't believe in you, you can feel that. But I had that myth telling me, if you felt something, that's inspiration. That's real. Listen, follow that, and have the courage to believe in yourself. That's the hard thing. It's turning off your targeting computer and saying, I will trust myself. Rebel Force Radio is going to work. I'm going to step out there and make a fool of myself if I have to, because I believe in this.
Every week.
Yeah. It's like walking into the archive building at Skywalker Ranch without the proper authority or going through all the red tape. It's just going in there and getting it done.
So I thought midichlorians invalidated that kind of approach, that inspiration is for everybody. And if you feel it, that's already telling you, yes, you can go somewhere with this. But I look back and I think, well, what my retcon would be, this is maybe George trying to say, it's not just hocus pocus and it's not just attitude. There's something real about the Force. I don't want it being just dismissed as it's the power of positive thinking. There's something real that we're talking about. And I thought, once I saw it that way, I thought, okay, well, from that angle, I can get behind it. So as long as it's not, do you have patrician blood instead of just plebeian blood? If that's not what it's about, if it's saying, I'm not just talking about attitude, I'm talking about there is something in the fabric of the universe that says these people who are willing to have that kind of courage, there is a force that will help you. And who knows what that is, but I do feel like there is something real there, that it's, and they used to say, what do they think? God helps those who help themselves. And I never knew what that was supposed to mean, because it sounds just like if you help yourself, you're doing your own work. But whatever you call it, the Force or anything else, there is something that helps those who take a chance and have courage, and things work out when you think it wasn't on paper that should have worked, but they tried and they kept trying and it worked. So if I see midichlorians from that angle, I can work with that.
All right. That was probably more than even Jason expected as far as a response. I mean, that was what a breakdown.
Rebel Force Radio.
Star Wars archaeologist David West Reynolds, you've been so generous with your time, but the thing I really want to hear about is what's up next for you. I understand you are taking the archaeology of Star Wars, but focusing on yet another Lucasfilm property and diving into the archaeology of Indiana Jones. So tell us all about that and tell us about Chasing Raiders.
At the Lucasfilm archives at Skywalker Ranch, which was my playground at Skywalker Ranch, I constantly came up with excuses for why, yes, again, he needs to get permission to go to the archives. And so I hang out there all the time. Working with all the Indiana Jones props, in addition to the Star Wars props, was fascinating because I was an archaeologist, right? I was trained working in museums with artifacts. And in the world of museums, they look down on Hollywood because, well, that stuff's all fake. Well, I get to the Indiana Jones artifact at Skywalker Ranch, and these things don't look like cheap movie props. They look not just like replicas. Some of these things look like forgeries. They're that good. I'm looking at some of these inscriptions, and they're not only in authentic ancient scripts. The grammar in the ancient Egyptian is correct. The name of Tutankhamun's wife, Ankhesenamun, is spelled correctly in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. What's going on with this movie? And so the Paramount ended up asking me to look into this for a documentary that we were considering, and that project didn't end up happening. But once I'd gotten asked to look into the real history and archaeology behind Indiana Jones, it became apparent that Raiders was this incredible, unique phenomenon amongst the Indiana Jones movies, certainly, but in all of cinema history, there's never been another adventure archaeology-themed movie that's this much connected with reality, with authentic history. So you can go through Raiders of the Lost Ark, and one thing after another is either authentic historical precedent or connected with something in real history. I launched a project to go hunt this stuff down. And I didn't just go and track down the movie locations. I did in Tunisia. I found the Tanis Digs, and I went to Hawaii and found the waterfall and the places where Indy is running from the Indians and all of that. but I wanted to get as close to the Indiana Jones experience as I possibly could. So I went to the places where Indy was supposed to have been in 1936. And that meant Cairo, and that meant northern Peru, to the actual Chachapoyas, where the temple of the Chachapoyan warriors is supposed to be located. And so from inside the archives and from archaeology, and then from the movie locations, but also the locations where the story was taking place, I ended up with this unique perspective on Raiders, to where scene after scene, no matter how many times you have watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, I can show you things in this film that you've never seen. It's that rich. And the whole story of how this even happened is great. So that's all part of the quest. But I've given talks about this all over the country at different museums. And not long ago, I got asked to speak about this at the Explorers Club in New York City. So Indiana Jones was finally at the Explorers Club, and I brought him there. And so even the explorers were willing to give Indy credit that nobody knew that much in the film was real. And so,
David, who were the consultants, if you don't mind, that were on the film that were giving it this authenticity?
I end up talking about this after I give talks about this, and at one of the talks, the guy sitting in the front row, oh, that's Norman Reynolds, isn't it? Yeah, it's Norman Reynolds, the art director on Raiders, and so I got to talk with him about this, and he was glad to do the research, but he said we would do this all the time if we could, but Raiders was this special case, and he said we did that because it was in the script, all these detailed things. So apparently the script wants this to be an authentic period movie. Except when you look at the history, you look at Steven Spielberg, the director, talks about, oh, this isn't any kind of a documentary. It's not a vision of how things were in 1936. And the guy who did all of the documentaries for the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, where George was deliberately mixing history with the fiction, he came to me and said, George doesn't know anything about all of this stuff that you found in Raiders. All of this is going to be a total surprise to him. So I tried to figure out, where did this come from? So, Jason, it's just saying it was a big question. Yeah. And it turns out the unsung hero is a woman named Deborah Fine, who was a researcher at Lucasfilm. She was in the Lucasfilm library, and she was the one who provided all of this wonderfully organized historical information to Lawrence Kasdan during the 6 months that he spent writing the Raiders script. And that's where it all traces back to. So Lawrence Kasdan, he's only had, Continental Divide. That's the only script that he's done before Raiders. And he gets into this story development session with George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. And he's brand new, in Hollywood. But George Lucas and Steven Spielberg are saying, help us create this story. And here's Deborah Fine. She'll do the research for you. So she does this wonderful package, piles and piles of research. And Kasdan puts it all in his script. So Indy's not just crossing a jungle river. He's crossing the upper Utcubamba River in the Chachapoyas department of northern Peru. And it's not just he cracks the bullwhip. The thong of the leather bullwhip, which is followed by the fall and the cracker at the end. I mean, all of this, the anatomy of the bullwhip is accurately understood. The Nazi, ranks are correctly understood. Yeah. And that's because Debbie Fine gave all of that material to Lawrence Kasdan, who assumed that that's the way they wanted it, even though George and Steven could have cared less. But we end up with a script that has all this detail in it. And the art department says, wow, this is really detailed. We better get to the British Museum. And that's exactly what they did. So It was kind of a misunderstanding, but it was Debbie's great work that made it all happen.
Wow. Amazing devotion to accuracy that you don't see in typical Hollywood productions. Not at all. Not at all. So the series you're working on is called Chasing Raiders, the Archaeology of Indiana Jones. And there's some fundraising to help production costs?
Absolutely. So about 5 years ago, I went to Kickstarter to see if Star Wars fans would help me do a very small-scale documentary on finding the Tunisia locations. And it produced what you're holding right there, Journey to Tatooine, which is a fun that was a little fan project, but I really appreciated the support that I got from the fan community to make that. That's what we're doing again. But this time, the production value is going to be broadcast quality. This time, we're going to produce something that I intend for it to end up getting distribution. But we can't do that unless people show up and give us a hand. So Kickstarter, the project is Chasing Raiders, and you can be part of this adventure if you come to Kickstarter, look for Chasing Raiders, and help us out, because this is going to show people a side of Indiana Jones that they never saw before.
Wow. So we encourage all of our listeners here, Rebel Force Radio, to go to Kickstarter and just do a search of Chasing Raiders, and it'll take you right to David's fundraiser. And are you guys offering your typical Kickstarter perks for donations?
Yes, indeed. And a problem with Kickstarter documentaries nowadays is that people say, well, we can't let you stream the movie as soon as we finish it because the distributors won't pick the film up if you've shared it with your backers. So to me, that's really unmotivating. We're going to give our backers a featurette version of the film that will include unique footage and unique content that won't even be in the release version. So our backers can get a special version of the film, a featurette version, in addition to artwork and pages from my journal. I've got a journal that I kept all around the world. It's my version of Henry Jones's Grail Diary, because I was the one who documented Henry Jones's Grail Diary prop in the archives. That was my job to make the archival record of that. So I soaked that into my blood, and I kept a journal all around the world. So I've got pages from that journal and reproductions that will be part of the many wonderful rewards for our backers.
David, I got to ask, is the project current? Because I'm on Kickstarter looking for it. Or is this by the time?
It is not yet.
Okay. All right. So by the time this goes live. Yes. Okay. All right. Very good. Just wanted to double check. When do you expect it to go live?
Well, I was planning on it being about a week, but hey, I understand the episode is going to air on November 1st. Is that right?
Yes.
And so we will have something up. So if it's not on Kickstarter, it'll be on my website, davidwestreynolds.com. But we'll see if we can get it up live with the episode. So one way or the other, you will find it.
Obviously, your history with Star Wars is prolific. You've authored so many books. You're a Star Wars expert, and you started as a fan, just like me and Jason and our listeners. So we think it's appropriate that we throw some questions at you that only you can answer. They're subjective in nature. They tap into your fandom, your likes, your dislikes, and your passion for Star Wars. These questions were compiled by Jedi Master Yoda himself. He faxed them to us. Actually, Yoda has a fax machine. He's not into texting. I don't think he has a smartphone, but he's still faxing, which is great. And we have a fax machine here in the RFR studios. And he sent us a questionnaire. So we would like to ask you, if you have a few more minutes, the Yoda Questionnaire.
The Yoda Questionnaire.
That's right. Thank you, Richard Cheese. That great intro. The Yoda Questionnaire, as Max said, there are no wrong answers, but there are answers that are more correct than others.
That's a look right there, David.
Yeah.
He's locked and loaded. He's strapped in and ready to go.
So, David, we're going to start off with our first question. This is an easy one. And by the way, this is not trivia here. Okay, this is not trivia. What's that?
Wrong? Yeah, there's that's the draft copy of Yoda's lightsaber. So I'm tapping into.
You've got that power. You've behind you.
Exactly.
You literally have the draft copy of the hilt of Yoda. That's incredible.
Because
just on a bookshelf behind him, as one does.
Yeah,
that should be Yoda his lightsaber. You know that.
You gave Yoda his lightsaber.
I gave Yoda
check
his
the
lightsaber.
facts. Yeah, it says right here. Right here it says David gave me the lightsaber. So
He puts that at the bottom of a lot of the faxes. I mean, he's great about that. I appreciate it.
And a note to go easy on you here. Well, that's very cool. So the first question is, who or what, in the interest of inclusivity here, we have to say, who or what is your favorite Star Wars character?
Okay, well, it's pretty, commonplace, but it's going to have to be Luke Skywalker because I learned the most from that character, especially in New Hope, but throughout. That character taught me errors that I was making and how to do things better. And thank God George was telling the truth in that myth. So that was a character that I learned the most from. So I enjoyed many, but that's my favorite for that reason.
How do you feel about the depiction of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi?
Well, yeah, I mean, I know these things get controversial, and that was not consistent with what I had seen earlier.
Well, I think you're just echoing the sentiments of Mark Hamill himself in making that statement.
Yeah.
We'll just leave it at that? Or?
Well, I mean, Star Wars is a rich phenomenon, and that means that it's different things for different people. And just because something doesn't work for me, if it works for someone else, I say, I'm happy for them to enjoy whatever works for them. So I don't spend my time criticizing something that works for someone else. But, if you ask me what works for me, that is not a myth that's going out and sharing truth or inspiring people. And that's what Star Wars should be. That's what the character of Luke was built and created to be. So when that character is not being used in that way, it's no longer being true to its roots, its origins, or its archetypes. And I think that's a pretty serious mistake.
That's a great answer, by the way. Now we're going to venture a little over to the dark side, if you don't mind. Who or what, David West Reynolds, is your least favorite Star Wars character?
Oh, least favorite?
Yeah.
I don't even tend to think in those directions. Maybe
there had to be.
You
You were doing these visual dictionaries. There had to be one that every time you got to that letter in the alphabet, you knew that character was coming up. You're going to have to write something about it. And you're like, okay. I got nothing for this guy.
I think it was Celebration. I think it was number 4 in LA. At the opening ceremony, we had a life-size Ewok on stage.
Steve Sansweet.
And they had me come on stage playing Indiana Jones in the whole Indiana Jones getup. And so if you were there or you know that story, I whipped the Ewok off the stage. So they played the Indiana Jones fanfare while the Ewok is running around, and Steve and I worked that out so that the Indiana Jones would rescue the fans from the domination of the terrible Ewok. So I know the Ewoks are there for the kids, and God bless them, but they drive me crazy. So that was very satisfying to get to crack the bull with.
And you got to whip one. You got to whip one. It was bad enough, David, on several episodes of RFR ago, someone had left us a voicemail and asked us, what pet would we like to have in the Star Wars universe? And I said Ewok. And then I got raked over the coals that I was, trying to enslave these sentient Ewoks, but I still wouldn't mind having one as a pet. But you got to whip one, so all right.
He behaved. After that, he was a very docile host. So I think everyone can agree that was a constructive response to the situation.
What's more cruel, hitting them one time where they really feel it, or hitting them a lot of times when they don't feel it? All right. I'm joking around, folks. So who are? Let's go. Let's go to this one. This is one of my favorite questions. Yoda doesn't dictate that we ask them all. We have a smattering here, and depending on who the guest, we like to go back and forth a little bit. But you've been quoting the Star Wars films quite a bit in our interview here. So I got to ask, what is your favorite Star Wars line? What line of dialogue from Star Wars do you love the most?
Okay, let me think. And you can cut out all of the hms and haws in the editing booth. So
we keep it real around here,
Well, there's so many great lines, but Oh, I think just for sheer sound quality, Mos Eisley Spaceport, you will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
Why does that line resonate with you? What about that?
Because that means he's been there. And this is not a guy, this Jedi Knight is not someone who complains lightly. He's not a complainer. So why is he getting so colorful? And he just has this deep contempt for this place. So to me, that was conjuring up the picture of this guy's got memories there. He's knocked around there, and it sounds, he's so contemptuous that he has dealt with people that he trusted and betrayed him in this place. He hates this place because it is full of people who will sell their own mother. And that's in his voice, and it's dangerous, but it's exactly where I'm leading you. Come on, Luke, this is where we're going, but I'm letting you know it's awful. And okay, let's go. By the way, be careful. So that sets us up for what are we going to find? This guy who, they're addressing him as General Kenobi, and years ago you helped my father in the Clone Wars. He's tough material. And for him to say, I think this is the most wretched place in the galaxy. This place is rotten. This place is low. That's colorful. So I can't wait to see what kind of mess we're going to get into there. So I maybe it's just because the scene was cool and the cliff and the view, but I like it.
True. And also the delivery from Sir Alec. But to back up what you were saying, as soon as they park the car at Mos Eisley, they get out and Ben says, this place could be a little rough. And they go walking into the cantina, and having all of that history applied to this environment that we as an audience have never been to before. But yet we're going into it carrying some baggage with us about the place. And when Ben says this place has been a little rough, you can tell he was saying that more from the perspective of a participant and not a spectator. Like he got his hands dirty in the Mos Eisley Cantina. That's a story begging to be told. And I would love to see it someday.
I mean, when he dismembers someone, he doesn't act shocked. He's just like, okay, is everyone going to give me some space at the bar now? Do I need to do anything else? You got the message. Okay. All right. I'm turning this off now. And it's like, once again, man, you guys never learn. That's his attitude. Instead of, oh, I just had to cut somebody's arm off. Sorry, Luke. Everybody chill out.
How many arms do I have to cut off in this joint before you
every time I come here?
Yeah. And of course, and so I wrote that into the visual dictionary, where you can read that, limbs that may fall off in altercations just seem to disappear, and nobody knows exactly what happens to them, but they do serve really good blood mixes that the lamproids enjoy. So is there a connection? We don't know.
Luke, this place can be a little rough. Every time I go there, I get a bowl of pretzels and dismemberment.
All right, David, what is your least favorite line in Star Wars? Is there a line? Now, Star Wars is replete with what many consider bad dialogue. So is there a line in Star Wars that every time you hear it, you just cringe maybe a little bit?
Okay, yes, but it's not going to be for the reason you think. And so I know I'm giving you all these weird curveball answers, but when Yoda says, do or do not, there is no try. Now that sounds very quotable and that sounds great, but in my experience, I mean, I have to look at that and say, okay, that's what Luke needed to hear at that time. There we go. See, it's totally quotable. It's everywhere.
And marketable.
Exactly. That's what Luke needed to hear. But in the real world, there's totally try, because in many situations, you're going to lose. You're going to fail. And the fact is, if you tried, that means you can walk out with your self-respect intact. You may fail the game or the project, but if you're playing life for, I want to get through this with self-respect. Like, you can't control, do you get sick? Do you get the other guy cheats? Or do you get hit by a bus? Does your partner get an illness and die? You can't control those things, but you can try to get through it in a way that earns your own self-respect. And whatever happens to you, that part you do control. And that's why the try is very important. So if you're in this thinking like, oh man, I started my own business and it flopped, and man, I feel like a failure because it says do or do not. There's no try. I did not. So I failed. I'm a loser. That's not the case, man. If you did your best and you learned something from it, then it's not a matter of you did not. You tried, and that was worthwhile. And so I respect Yoda. That was the Buddha himself talked in different ways. He always knew exactly what his listener needed to hear. So I trust the master. That's what Luke needed to hear. But it's a line that you said, what do I cringe over? And that's one that I cringe over because it makes people beat themselves up when actually you don't need to. If you look at the fact that the trying counts, that's where you can determine, did I step up or not? And
I think a direct relative of that line, as far as George Lucas dialogue goes, comes in the prequels when Qui-Gon Jinn says your focus determines your reality. So if you want to put yourself out there and let yourself get beat up mentally, that's the life you're going to be living. But if you want to choose a more positive and self-assured approach, then that will be your reality, even in the face of turmoil and disaster.
Absolutely.
All right. David, got one more here for you. We saved the best for last. We always try to customize this for the guests, so I'm going to take I'm going to take some liberties with this one. But if there was another Star Wars movie to be made, and we know there will be many, but this one's different. This one's going to be directed once again by the maker himself, George Lucas. And he needed some really great locations for this film. He needed to top what he did in his 6 Star Wars films. And you were the guy that he picked to find those locations to bring his vision to life. What would you like to hear George say after he toured those locations with you?
Well, since I was hired on multiple locations to scout locations for George to review, I got sent to Peru at one point to scout for the prequels. And I found some incredibly cool places that are off the beaten track and that I thought would work fabulously for the Star Wars universe. And Peru is a very difficult place to work in, so it didn't make production sense. But as far as visually, this was weird and different, and nobody's seen anything like it. And you could come up with some very wild storytelling to go with these places in Peru. So that's what I would like to hear. I would like to hear George say, where's that stuff from David West Reynolds? That was pretty good. Let's look at that.
I don't think there's ever been a moment where we asked that last question, the Yoda Questionnaire, where the guest said, that actually happened to me. But in this instance, you're the first. So, wow, well done. Thank you.
I do have to ask, in relation to the prequels, the Peru location, how does that come into play?
Well, at the time, the reason I got sent down there was sort of a flimsy excuse for some other things that I wanted to do, but Rick was looking for grasslands because they knew that the Naboo battle was going to need these wide open, mostly grasslands. And at the time, the nature of those grasslands was not clear. And I knew that where I was going to be going in Peru for this other project that I was working on, I was going to see some landscapes like that, but that just had some really intriguing geology here and there as well. And so Rick said, that would be worth it. So yeah, I'm commissioning you, go and add this to your list of objectives when you're working there in Peru. And so I did my full location scouting report, just like I had done for him in Tunisia. And so it was hunting Naboo battle locations was what that started with. But he said, keep your eyes open as well. And that's where I ended up seeing these other things that were be for something completely different down the road.
Okay. And what was that down the road?
Oh, well, I mean, these were just possibilities for, slave quarters for a planet. What would it look like where the whole planet was enslaved? And I found landscapes and strange cliffs where you could imagine, oh, this is what a whole planet would look like if the whole world were enslaved, and you're practically like working in hell. And it's not volcanic, it's not that literal kind, but just a world unlike any that we've seen. And that's what Tunisia gave us with the first film, where we'd never seen salt flats and underground homes. And so the things that I found in Peru, they would be yet another unexplored corner of the Star Wars universe.
Wow. It's good to know that there's still super exotic earthbound locations that can be tapped for Star Wars sometimes in the future. So I hope they call you up to find those locations, actually. Any desire or contact as far as continuing your career officially within Star Wars?
I mean, hey, sure. If that's still work that I could do. And I wrote so much material for the visual dictionaries that we ended up having to cut for length, that I've still got files full of material, some of which went through the approval process. But then the scope of the visual dictionaries was originally going to be much, much larger. And then they ended up cut down for commercial reasons. And so I had all this material that I developed that went into more depth on Jedi history and how the lightsabers tie into, different aspects of the rituals and all of that. So I've got files full of that were from back during the pure original days when George is up in his office and they're up on the art department on the third floor and they're cranking out the high quality stuff. So sure, I would love to do that, get involved in that again.
Yeah. Well, it's a whole different universe now with Disney owning the franchise, but never say never.
Exactly. I mean, hey, you can find me at davidwestreynolds.com. So the reason they brought me to the ranch in the first place was they were concerned with launching the new prequel trilogy, that we need someone who understands what the fans want. And that's why Steve Sansweet was brought on, and that's why I was brought on. And we delivered that, and I could still deliver that.
Wow. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And we hope that it doesn't go quite as long of a gap before we talk to you again. We really want to follow along the success. We know it's going to be successful of the Kickstarter campaign for the Raiders documentary. Can you give us those details one more time on how people can, where they can go and how they can be part of this?
Absolutely. It's Chasing Raiders is the new documentary that's going to go into the real archaeology behind Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And this project's going to be funded on Kickstarter. So please go to Kickstarter and look for Chasing Raiders and the archaeology of Indiana Jones. And there's all different levels for backers. We appreciate any level of support. Everything helps. And every bit of support we get allows us to deliver a greater and greater documentary and unveil all of these stories that I can't wait to share. And my website, davidwestreynolds.com, is a place you can go also to learn more details.
Fantastic.
Great.
Well, we will be following that with great interest, as it was said. So thanks so much, David, and all the best to you. And we look forward to catching up with you again soon on
It's been too long. It's a real pleasure to speak with both of you again. Really is. Thank you for having me back. And
right back at you, David.
For connecting me with Roger, starting so many other things happening. Cheers. Yeah. You are an important force in Star Wars.
Well, thank you, as you are as well, and just an incredible source of information. And I'm in Chicago. Jason's in Cleveland. You're in Indiana. We're like David West Reynolds bookends. And so maybe we could get together sometime in the future. I would really, really love that.
I love that idea. Let's work that out. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Take care. All right, there he goes, David West Reynolds. Check it out, davidwestreynolds.com, and go to Kickstarter and back Chasing Raiders.
Chewie, get us out of here!
Oh, man, but look at that. Look at how fast the time goes when you hang out with us here at Rebel Force Radio. Thank you so much to David West Reynolds. What a fun time that was. That guy, I tell you, he could, well, you just got to, he can just tell so many great stories. He's been there for so much. of Star Wars history, particularly that incredible time period when Star Wars was coming back after that 16-year hiatus after the release of Return of the Jedi, and then back into the theaters with The Phantom Menace, and took a guy like Rick McCallum, who, as we were talking about, was a bit of a rebel in his own right, to bring a guy like Dr. David West Reynolds into the fold at Lucasfilm to say that this guy knows what he's talking about. He's a doctor, for God's sake. So great to catch up with him. As we said earlier, patreon.com, that's a place where you can find more Rebel Force Radio in your life. So if you want to fill the void of us not having a new podcast next week, you can check us out over at patreon.com/Rebel Force Radio, or go to rebelforceradio.com and click on that Patreon banner on the right rail, and you'll be taken to your selection of options for how you would like to support the operation here at Rebel Force Radio, including things like weekly full show video. That's a benefit for the All Access members and above. Exclusive podcasts you can't find anywhere else. The Q&A, the RPG, the Babu Freaks, they're all there. Can't find those on Spotify. You can't find those on Apple Podcasts. Only available on the RFR Patreon. And, of course, the community that you find there is the best in the galaxy. You're never going to find a better group of Star Wars fans to just have conversation with, talk about Star Wars with. You hear many of them on our after shows. I got to tell you, I'm really looking forward to Skeleton Crew for a lot of reasons, but mainly just to get back with those live after shows. They're so much fun.
Yeah.
So much fun.
And even more fun when we're doing them during the holiday season. I find.
Yeah, I agree. Great time to come together as Star Wars fans. Also, more Rebel Force Radio can be found on YouTube. You can find, we've been doing this quite a long time, so there's a great repository of clips and all that you can find at Rebel Force Radio on YouTube, youtube.com/Rebel Force Radio. You can find us on all of the social platforms, Instagram, X, Facebook. We're there, rebelforceradio.com. That's the official website. And if you want to help us out, the best way to do it, and it costs you nothing, is just to keep doing what you're doing right now, which is listen to this podcast, refer this podcast to your friends. When Skeleton Crew comes out, you know that the people are going to find you in the office. They're going to find you. They're going to say, hey, there's a new Star Wars TV show on Disney Plus. What can you tell me about it? And you tell them about it. You say, hey, if you want to really dig in deep, check out the guys over at Rebel Force Radio, that podcast. They do these after shows, and it's a great way to follow along with other Star Wars fans what's happening as the Star Wars storytelling, the galaxy, the mythos unfolds with new shows like Skeleton Crew. So refer your friends, leave us a review if your podcatcher of choice allows you to do so. Just one simple rule, please.
Make them good.
That'll do it for us. We'll see you in a couple weeks. Taking the week off next week. We'll be back with all new Rebel Force Radio the following week, but check out Patreon. You need to fill that void. So we'll see you next time. For Rebel Force Radio, I'm Jason.
I'm Jimmy Mack.
And remember,
the Force will be with you, always.
Here's my mask. I'm a Star Wars.